All right, y'all, welcome. Thanks for braving the heat and coming into the air condition. I wanted to share that video with you just now to give you a glimpse of who our speaker is today, Everett Worthington. Ev is, as he stated very clearly, a man of faith who models curiosity, humility, and this desire both to love God but to love as many of his neighbors as he possibly can. And in many ways, he embodies, he represents the kinds of things we're trying to do at Science for the Church, the ministry that I lead. We very much want our churches to be raising up a generation of scientists that follow in Ev's footsteps, trying to understand God's amazing creation and how to apply the tools of science to reach as many people as possible. Science for the Church was founded in 2020. We're relatively new. We grow out of several programs that piloted how do you do this work in churches. And we learned enough to be able to confidently say the engagement of science can strengthen the church when we do it thoughtfully and when we do it relationally. The real power comes not just when we're debating the ideas, of which there's lots of interesting debates that can be had, but when we meet people like Everett Worthington, when we meet the scientists that are in our churches and we engage them and we learn what motivates them. We learn what their research is and how they're trying to make the world a better place through that research. That relational work between the church and the scientists that are in the church and those that are in our communities is where we found real value in connecting faith and science. So I'm excited to have Dr. Worthington with us today, kind of to model that and to help us, while doing so, learn something that's very important to us in the church, to learn a little bit about forgiveness. All right, we have several sponsors that I want to briefly introduce for this event. The first is the North Carolina Council of Churches. They are hosting our live stream. Now, I'm sorry for the delay. It just took a minute to get that live stream public. Jennifer Copeland, their executive director, was preaching in Asheville today and could not get back in time to offer a word of welcome. So let me briefly kind of introduce you to their work, and I need to be advancing slides. There you can click on the QR code to learn more. But the Council of Churches was founded in 1835. They've been around in this state for a number of years. They represent over 6,000 congregations and 19 denominations across the state of North Carolina. And they enable churches and people of faith to impact our state on issues such as economic justice and development, human well-being, equality, and compassion and peace following the example and mission of Jesus Christ. Their work contributes to equitable, compassionate, and thriving communities for all. Our next sponsor is West Raleigh here, and I'm going to invite Kat up to say a word of welcome.
On top, Drew?
Yep.
Good afternoon. My name is Kat Kusmal. I am the pastor for community formation here at West Raleigh. And what that looks like is that I get to form community, and this is one opportunity to do that. We are glad that you're here, whether you're here in person or on the live stream. If you're here in person, I can't do this for the live stream. There are refreshments and water and coffee. If you're looking for a restroom, they're through the double doors that are back there. One of the things that I feel lucky to be a part of at West Raleigh is doing this work, figuring out how to connect people with people, figuring out how to raise up leaders, all kinds of leaders in the church, to do unconditional welcome, to embrace equity, to look at injustice, to fight back against dismantling racism, to fight back against it, to do the work of dismantling racism, to care for creation, and to spread our wings as people of faith who learn. So we're glad you're here. Ev, I'm glad you're here, and we look forward to hearing from you. And if y'all have questions, I'm here. My colleague Catherine is also here if we can be helpful. And if you're meeting us for the first time, yes, we are a Kat and Catherine combination. So welcome.
Thank you, Kat. All right, our final sponsor today is the Well Mental and Spiritual Care Center, located in downtown Raleigh at Edenton Street United Methodist Church. They create pathways towards healing and wholeness in our community, offering accessible and affordable mental and spiritual care. We have Reverend Amanda Rigby, their executive director, with us. She's going to be responding to Ev's talk, so you can ask her questions if you want to learn more during that time or at the end of the program. We have representation here from the well. So on behalf of our sponsors, to those of you online, to those of you here, we are very glad you decided to brave the beautiful weather and join us. All right, the reason we're here is to learn from Everett Worthington. He is a pioneer in research on forgiveness. You can't read any of the scientific study of forgiveness and not see his name. But he trained first in counseling psychology, specifically marriage and family, before he arrived at Virginia Commonwealth in the late 1970s, where he stayed until it was around 2017, 2018, about 40 years on faculty at VCU. He's done, in addition to the work on marriage and family counseling, he's done a lot of work on virtues, things like forgiveness, humility, patience, and more general work on the psychology of religion. We could have asked him to speak on a number of topics, but forgiveness is the one that he's most known for. He's written over a dozen books. You can spend quite a bit of time reading his extensive writings. My favorite is this one. We had a group here at West Raleigh read Forgiving and Reconciling for Lent. It's a fantastic introduction written for InterVarsity Press. And if you go look him up online, he's one of those accomplished scholars who has a CV that is approaching 100 pages. All the research, all the writing, all the service, all the amazing things that he has done. One of the important contributions that he has made to the work on forgiveness specifically is he led a campaign for forgiveness research for about 7 or 10 years. And it funded interdisciplinary work on forgiveness, not just the psychological work that he was doing, but work across the sciences and across the humanities. And so he's got this wealth of perspective, as well as his own faith, the biblical, the theological work at trying to understand forgiveness. In addition, not surprisingly, he's been a wonderful mentor. I've had the privilege of getting to know a handful of his students. They all love him. They're all wonderful, continuing to bring their scientific work to the service of the church. And he's also a faithful husband and family member. We're really gracious that he took time to come today. His wife is recovering, just recently returned home, and he's the primary caregiver, but he was willing to drive down and join us today for this program. So let me offer a brief word of prayer, and then I'm going to hand it over to you, Ev. Let us have a word of prayer. Creator God, thank you for the opportunity each and every day to enjoy the work of your hands, to try to understand how you knit us in our mother's wombs, and to try to learn how we are to relate to one another as followers of Christ. In this time, we ask your blessing upon Ev and on each of us as we learn about forgiveness, as we bring faith and science together to do the holy work that you have called us to do, to forgive as we have been forgiven. So be with us now and help us to go out into the world as a people that offer forgiveness and reconciliation to the world around us. We ask this in your name and for your sake. Amen. All right, Ev.
I want to say one thing first, and I'm afraid to climb up on there. You got to say after this. Well, it probably will go off, of course.
Let's.
Wait a minute. In the early 1980s, actually 1984, I just figured out today, I got from Bob Gluharif a newsletter which just said in a little blurb, and I quote, and you'll hear this again, everybody: forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not excusing. It is not smoothing things over. It is reaching into the unchangeable past, cutting away the wrong, erasing the hurt. But the last two parts of that have been the most important parts for me. The grace to do it is from God, but the decision to do it is our own. I wrote this on an index card and kept it propped up on the kitchen counter all many, many years. Over the past 53 years, I have made many copies and carried them in my wallet, giving a copy to everyone I encountered who I thought might need it. It has helped many of us. I always wondered who wrote these wonderful words, and now I think I know. Dr. Worthington, thank you from the bottom of my heart. You can't imagine what this has meant to me and my husband. Thank you.
So one of the things we do is we great. What do we pray about? We pray about everything. We pray about, for discernment. How should we do this? Should we do this? Is now the time? We pray about, God, help me. God, create in this person a willingness to receive. we're praying without ceasing, basically. So prayer is like the cornerstone of our practical theology of forgiveness. But we also seek. We seek a number of things. We seek guidance through Scripture, but we also seek models of forgiveness that we know through our congregation, models that we know actually through a broader swath of culture, history, public life. You know, we're looking always for how do people forgive things. And that's why the news often will, you know, and some of the positive things that the news comes out with is looking at people who forgive these horrendous acts. And sometimes we just scratch our head and go, how can they do that? But if they can do that, then maybe I can do that too. We also want to practice restraint. So we can practice restraint in a lot of ways. We can decide, I am not going to get even with this person. I'm going to seek God on this, and I'm going to ask God for maybe divine intervention, or I'm going to just relinquish this to God. This is not my problem. This is your problem, Lord. So we can also practice restraint by deciding, okay, I'm just going to tolerate this. I'm going to put up with it. Yeah, I know that's hard. I'm not going to be happy about this, but, you know, that's what I've decided to do. Or I could forbear. I could decide to forbear. This is different. Paul says forgiving them and forbearing. You know, he treats these things as different. Forbearance is to tolerate something for the good of a relationship. I'm going to forbear responding negatively for the good of my relationship with my wife, for the good of my relationship with people at church, for the good of relationship at work or wherever. So this is forbearance. Or we could just decide, I'm just going to accept this. You know, life is too short to get all upset about this. I'm just going to move on with life. So we're practicing restraint as a way of dealing with. And then another category of things is to count our blessings. So that is, you know, we know it's good for the person we forgive if we forgive them. We know that we are given the power to bind things on earth, which binds them in heaven, but we can also loose things on earth, which loose them in heaven. And so we know that somehow by forgiving, we might be able to loose something up in the heavenly that I don't understand at all, and I don't have to understand it. I just know that this can benefit that person that I forgive. But I also will receive a blessing in forgiving. Now, I don't forgive to get that blessing. That blessing comes along just as a byproduct of making the right choice. It's like making a choice to be a Christian. You make this choice to be a Christian. You get amazing blessings from that. But we don't become a Christian so we can get these blessings. We become a Christian, and then we get the blessings. We forgive, and then we get the blessings. Another thing that is a kind of a practical theology strategy is to encourage a decision to forgive. So God forgives us, and then so we can forgive other people. And then finally, I can also just look at God's general revelation and learn from general revelation. I can learn from science. I can learn from literature. I can learn from humanities. I can learn from the arts. And lots of things about forgiving. I can just picture Rembrandt's picture of the prodigal, which I know we've all seen. And that's just so moving. And I think it's Henry Nouwen that wrote a book about it where he said he sat and looked at it for 8 hours and just pondered that, and it changed his life. So we know these things. Now, I'm just going to kind of give you a quick look ahead. We've developed interventions in clinical science to help people forgive. And we've done these with Christians. And there are Christian accommodated interventions that have, used the language of Christianity, the concepts. And then there's secular interventions. When we do these with Christian population, what we find is no difference whether it is a secular or a Christian accommodated intervention. No difference. Why is that? Well, it turns out that some scientists, Ken Pargament and Mark Rye, asked people who had gone through this, Christians who had gone through a secular intervention, how did they forgive? How did they learn to forgive? And they say, well, we pray about this and we search the scriptures and we use restraint and in other words, they're doing all the Christian things even though they're not dealt with in the secular intervention. So it turns out there's not really much difference. Well, that's just kind of jumping ahead. So if we try these things, within the church, then what happens is they're going to work most of the time, but not always. And, we just can't always have our way, no matter how righteously we try to live. Life intrudes on that. And so if they aren't working, then let's look to science. Let's see what science can tell us that might help us forgive. So let me just tell you that there are probably 3 major theories that try to account for parts of forgiveness, but really one of them is used that much, and the other 2 are used that much. So the one that's used the most is a stress and coping theory of forgiveness. So this draws on a general stress and coping theory, and it kind of modifies it to consider forgiveness. So the general, okay, my picture is not there. The general theory is this. What happens is we are exposed to a stressor, and we evaluate that stressor. We appraise the stressor. We go, could this be threatening to me? And then if it could be threatening, can I deal with this? And based on my appraisal, then that creates in me a stress response. And that stress response is physiological, it's cognitive, it's emotional, it's motivational, it's about my decision, about how I intend to behave. In other words, that stress response incorporates kind of every way that I can respond to this. And then if I don't like the response, then I try to change my response. I try to cope with it. And I can try to cope by changing the situation, the stressor, by changing my appraisal, or by changing my stress response in some way. So now the stress and coping theory of forgiveness says that the stressor is an injustice or an offense that I experience. And then I appraise it by going, how threatening is this to me? Can I cope with it? But I make another type of evaluation, and this is what I call the injustice gap. So the injustice gap is a subjective sense of how much injustice did this do to me. So I'm starting my computer going about how, is it that much? Did somebody bump me in the street and it's only that much? Or somebody really did something terrible to me, it's that much? And then I keep my computer going, and so I may find out that they apologize. And I know that's hard. And so some justice came back into that system. And so that lowers the size of that gap. And they not only apologize, but maybe they, try to make amends in some way. So, or they could go, I say, it hurt my feelings when you, did such and such and hurt me, and they go, well, life is full of little disappointments, isn't it? So if that happens, what happens to my injustice gap? It gets bigger, right? So I am keeping this ongoing tally. But if I say, well, it hurt my feelings when you did such and such, and they go, oh my gosh, I didn't know, and they fall down, and I'm going, this is good. You see, and they're crying, and they go, I am so sorry. Oh, that's good. Can I do anything to make up for what I did? Like, could I give you like $1 million? And I'm like, that would take some of the edge off of it. And then they might say, how about cleaning your toilets for the rest of my adult life? And I'm like, okay, I'm there. So basically what's happened is the person has, it's not just a person, but the system, everything has the ability, because this is an ongoing evaluation, to get what seemed like a gap that was so big, it's like jumping the Grand Canyon, down to a place where I can maybe step over it, or at least jump over it by forgiving. So we have the stressor, and then we have the appraisal, which includes this ongoing appraisal of how big that injustice gap is right now. And then we have the physiological responses that are stress responses that involve things like cortisol being pumped into our body. Well, cortisol is great for being pumped into our body. It helps us deal with, immediate stressors. But our body is not created to keep a high level of cortisol, as you, I'm sure, know, because you can't open a newspaper or magazine today without seeing some article on stress. And so cortisol, in the steady state being high, can damage every system in our body. It can damage our cardiovascular system. It can damage our immune system, our sexual reproduction system, our gastrointestinal system. It can shrink part of our brain, the hippocampus, which is what processes immediate experiences and turns them into memory. It can reduce the size of the hippocampus by as much as 25%. I don't want to have that big cortisol problem. I don't want all the other negative physiological events that come along with feeling unforgiving, and so I try to cope with that, and forgiveness is one of the ways that I cope. So this stress and coping theory is a theory, and that's not like, oh, that's just a theory. No, a theory in science is something that has been supported and supported and supported until we believe this is a pretty good representation of reality, realizing it's not going to be a complete representation. And we might even overthrow the theory later. So, one of the things that this stress and coping theory of forgiveness gives us, it gives us a sense of what forgiveness is and what forgiveness isn't. So, what forgiveness is, there are basically 4 different kinds of forgiveness. So one of those is divine forgiveness. This is an apprehension, so this is a human apprehension that God has forgiven me. Okay, that's divine forgiveness. That's being studied right now at Florida State University by Frank Fincham, and he has funded 10 grants off of that big grant that he has. And so there's a lot of research going on right now on divine forgiveness that's going to kind of flood the scientific market, if you will, soon. Another type of forgiveness that is experienced mostly as a wrongdoer is what we call self-forgiveness. Now, self-forgiveness is really psychologically much more about dealing with my self-condemnation than it is about how do I forgive myself. I spend much more time thinking about how bad I feel, how shamed, how guilty, how anxious, how angry, and on and on. So self-forgiveness, until 2005, self-forgiveness was virtually absent from the scientific literature. But Frank Fincham, Frank should be up here giving this talk probably, but Frank wrote a paper in which he called self-forgiveness the forgotten ugly stepchild of forgiveness research, and basically shamed the entire field into studying self-forgiveness. So now there's a robust literature on it. The other 2 types of forgiveness are what I call person-to-person forgiveness or forgiving others. That's the way I'm going to spend most of my time. And then lastly, intergroup forgiveness. This is an individual who works to forgive members of a group where those members may not have ever had any contact with the person at all. But because they did something I disapprove of, or they hurt others, or they just are the wrong type of people, then I, may hold unforgiveness toward them. And so intergroup forgiveness is being able to forgive members of an out-group. So what forgiveness is not, well, we know forgiveness is not a lot of things. It is not reconciliation. It is not, this is what forgiveness is, sorry. But forgiveness is not reconciliation. It's not excusing what was done to me. It's not justifying what was done. It's not forbearing. It's not just accepting and moving on with life. What is it? It is a way that we deal with injustice and unforgiveness. So unforgiveness is a emotional, motivational state of resentment, bitterness, hostility, hate, anger, fear. And so one of the ways that I can deal with that is to change the way that I act towards somebody who hurt me. And another way is to manage my own internal emotions. So it actually is going to turn out that there are 2 types of forgiving others. Yeah, so there is what it's not. So there are these 2 types of forgiveness. So there's not one forgiveness. There's 2, okay, of forgiving others. And they're different from each other. So one is to make a decision about how you intend to act toward this person. I am not going to get even with them, not going to try to pay them back. So it involves restraint. It involves the frontal cortex and this part of the brain that develops throughout adolescence that helps me do the right thing and not do the wrong thing. And then so I'm going to restrain myself from negative response, but also I am going to treat that person as a valued and valuable person. Christians would say a person created in God's image. So it involves a behavioral activating system as well as a behavioral inhibition system. And that's a decision to forgive. Now, I can make a decision to forgive and carry it out for the rest of my life and yet never feel peace about this. And every time I think about it, I get upset. And that suggests there must be a second type of forgiveness, and that is emotional forgiveness, in which I replace the negative, unforgiving emotions with positive, other-oriented emotions, like empathy, compassion, love for the person. So, two types of forgiveness. They are weakly related to each other. So the research, if you look at the whole body of research that looks at decisional and emotional forgiveness, they are only correlated about 0.4. So I don't know if that means anything to you, but basically it says that accounts for only 16% of the shared variability. That is not a strong connection. That says that most of the time, we're making a decision to forgive, but we're still wrestling with the emotions. Or something happened and we feel compassion toward this person. We never made a decision to treat them differently, but the negative emotions went away. It can occur, those can occur in either order, and they often, only one of them occurs instead of both of them at the same time. So those are two different types of emotion. Now, I've already talked about the injustice gap. That's a second idea that comes out of this stress and coping theory. And it says that, there's this gap that's created, and you keep manipulating the size depending on what happens. Now, it turns out that there are a lot of ways to cope with injustices in our life. Forgiveness is just one of those. So, and of course I can cope by trying to get the person back or seek vengeance on them. This is not a good thing. It's going to create a response to get vengeance back toward me. So, but there are these really good ways to cope, such as I can seek justice. I can observe justice. Justice is social and societal. You may notice that forgiveness is always inside your skin. It is a decision that you make. It is an emotional change. It's inside your skin. So I can seek or observe justice being done, and that will reduce that injustice gap. But I also could turn the matter over to God. And we do this all the time. God, zap that guy. This is okay. This is just an appeal to divine justice. God, you can do this. But I could also just relinquish it to God. And I also could just minimize the importance of this is not important, not worth worrying with. I could decide to accept it and move on. I can forbear. I can tolerate this. I can do lots of different things to lower the size of that injustice gap to get it to the place where I can forgive. The fourth thing that this general theory has brought, I guess I probably want to tell you a little story here. I didn't mention it, but the offender can get the natural consequences of their behavior. Okay, that's a kind of a justice, you see, and that helps us lower the injustice gap. So I used to ride my bicycle to work, and it was like 8 miles down to VCU, and so I would get on the bike in the morning, and, you know, I'd be riding down the street, and the problem was the first street I had to ride on was Skipwith Avenue, and it's got like an elementary school at this end and an elementary school at this end. And what that meant is about the time I'm going to work every day, the traffic is going both directions just like mad. And so here I am riding my bike and trying not to fall in the ditch on the side because there's no sleeve on the edge of the road. This just falls off into a ditch. And I happened to notice this one day that there's this truck behind me, and it's not passing me. And so I look over my shoulder, and this weren't your ordinary truck. This was like a big truck with big wheels and up in the air, you know, and up in the, you know, cab is this guy sitting, and he's like really frustrated. He's trying to get by me. Did I mention that there's a gun in the gun rack? This was Virginia, remember? So there's this gun in the gun rack behind him, and he's pounding on the steering wheel, you know, and deking out, and he can't get by. And I am now motivated, and I'm, you know, like pedaling like mad, and eventually a break occurs in the traffic. And, you know, I hear him coming, you know, and he roars up, and he gets like right off of my port quarter here, and he just plays on the horn, beep, you know, whereupon I run off of the road into the ditch. And so here I am down in the ditch, bouncing around, you know, and then I fight my way back onto the road, and he's off down the road a little, and then I made an error in judgment. I made a gesture. You know, I mean, it wasn't much of a gesture. I just turned loose of the handlebars and did something like this. Brake lights come on. He starts queuing up people behind him. And I'm riding up going, uh-oh. You know, do not escalate this any further. You know, don't look at him. Just ride on by. You know, just go on by. And so I ride on by, and, you know, he's kind of frustrated, and he matches my speed. I'm not looking at him, but I can see him out of the corner of my eye here. And I see him, it's a really old pickup truck, and so I see him holding on the steering wheel, sliding across the cab, right? Rolling down the window. You remember those? You used to have to, yeah, anyway. And then he holds his hand out the window, and he begins to lower his fingers one by one until he was pointing the way to heaven with one of his fingers. I thought he was probably witnessing to me, pointing the way to heaven like that. Anyway, having made his point, he just accelerates, you know, throws dust and gravel up, and takes off up the hill. I'm riding up the hill, and I'm thinking, deep existential thoughts, probably what you would be thinking about how life hangs by a slender thread, and sometimes one stupid gesture can threaten to kind of cut that thread. And then I crest the hill, and there he is, parked at the side of the road. And I am like, really? You know, get a life. And then I notice that one of Henrico County's finest officers is writing him a valentine of some kind. And as I went by, because I'm a very friendly guy, I could not help but give him the Queen's wave and a nice smile, too. But not being a stupid guy, I did ride off into the neighborhood and hide so that he couldn't find me later. I didn't feel any unforgiveness toward him because the natural consequences that he got just closed down that injustice gap. So no injustice gap, no problem, no stress. All right. So another thing that the general stress and coping theory of forgiveness has brought us is benefits of forgiving to the person who is doing the forgiving. And those benefits are spiritual as well as psychological and relational and physical. And there's a lot of these benefits I could go into. And we're going to have a Q&A. If you want to hear about them ad nauseum, be sure to ask about that. Okay, well, I just want to point out that forgiveness is related to flourishing. And flourishing is kind of living a life well lived in the many important areas. And so there's been a substantial research. You will be tested on this. Did I mention that? So you have to quote these things. Well, not really. There have been quite a number of studies that have looked at the relationship between forgiveness and flourishing. One of those is a giant intervention study involving almost 4,600 people in 5 different countries. Established a good, strong relationship between forgiveness and flourishing. But also, we spun out of that 2 Christian samples, and forgiveness was related to flourishing in those Christian samples too. We have done other research on the global flourishing study of a longitudinal study of 22 different countries with millions of people, and we found that forgiveness is related to flourishing all over the world. It's not just a U.S. phenomenon, even in countries that are very troubled. So we have also looked at the difference between emotional and decisional forgiveness, and do they have different effects on flourishing? And the answer is yes, they both are related to flourishing. We thought when we started that research that emotional forgiveness really would be the strong driver of effects on flourishing. Turned out it wasn't. It turns out decisional forgiveness was the major driver of an effect on flourishing. And that was true in a number of different types of flourishing, whereas only social flourishing was related to emotional forgiveness. Okay, like I say, the bottom line is, we want to encourage people to forgive. That's the bottom line. Okay, let me turn away from basic science of forgiveness and what it tells us to intervention science. So this is about people who have designed interventions to help people forgive. And it turns out there are 14 of these that are evidence-based. And so I looked at all 14 and looked into their methodology, and what I found was that there are a lot of shared things that each of the interventions do. So these shared principles, and here are the different interventions. You can just look at the list. Fred Luskin's cognitive behavioral-based Forgive for Good, Les Greenberg's emotion-focused therapy for couples, Nathaniel Wade's process model. There are 14 of these. Here are the 6 similarities that they all share. All of them motivate forgiving by recounting the benefits of forgiving. So, you want to help somebody forgive, mention the benefits. You don't have to spend much time on these, but there are spiritual benefits of reconnecting with God when there's a breach, relational benefits to forgiving. There are mental health benefits and spiritual or physical health benefits. All 6 of these have people forgive a specific hurt. You can't learn to be more forgiving in general. You have to work through individual hurts. Usually a person will say, okay, I don't like this person. This person's got it in for me. It's an evil boss. You know that boss, right? So, and, this Darth Vader of a boss, is just evil. What's the worst thing that he or she has ever done? Let me try to work to forgive that. What's the second worst? Let me try to forgive that. The third worst, forgive that. After a while, we find we've forgiven that person. We don't need to do all 588, harms that he has inflicted or she has inflicted. Then I might move to another person and then to another person. And that practice of forgiving different people for different events helps us become more forgiving as a person. Okay, third, all of these get the person to recall the hurt that they experienced and to process that hurt emotionally, what it meant to them and what kind of problems it's inflicted on them. And then fourth, to invite the potential forgiver to take the perspective of the other person, to empathize with the other person, to feel compassion for the other person. Fifth, to invite the potential forgiver to kind of admit to themselves that they have hurt people, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes actually intentionally, and to accept that that's part of the human condition. That person is not Satan incarnate just because they hurt you daily 10 times a day. I have hurt people too. They are a person. Okay, number 6 is to encourage forgiveness as a choice. It's not a duty, it's a choice. Now, it may be a duty. For Christians, we have verses that really make it a strong, you need to forgive. But telling someone that is not going to help them forgive. It's actually going to make them kind of bow their shoulders up and let it run off their back, and you'll do negative good, not positive good, by insisting on a duty to forgive. Okay, so one of these interventions is this reach forgiveness model that we have developed, and I just want to give you a feel for this. I'm just going to run through a few exercises that we use. These can be done in psychoeducational groups. They can also be done in a do-it-yourself workbook, which uses the same, basically the same exercises. So the reach forgiveness model has a core of trying to help people make an emotional forgiveness so that they feel more like making a decision to forgive. Notice that you might have thought you make a decision and that leads to emotional change, and it does sometimes. But it can work either way, and we try to help people experience emotional change, feel better, and therefore make a decision to forgive. That's the core of that method. And I've already mentioned it can be done in groups. And I should say these are very effective. We've done quite a number of studies. This was in 2024. I reviewed the literature. It was actually 2023 when I was reviewing the literature, and found 25 randomized controlled trials supporting groups to forgive. There are now 30, and they're growing, all over the world. Do-it-yourself workbooks, not as supported in number of studies, but it had one huge study in 5 countries who very much need forgiveness: China, Indonesia, Ukraine, 2 different sites, one near the front, one in Kiev, Colombia, 60 years of civil war, and South Africa. 4,600, actually 4,598 people went through these, which is more people going through that study than all other intervention studies from all 14 put together. Huge study. So these are both very well supported. The core of the method is REACH, which is emotional forgiveness. Recall the hurt. It's very easy to say these quickly. It takes about 4 hours to work through them, usually, in a group. Recall the hurt. Empathize so that you emotionally replace the negative with the positive. Give an altruistic, undeserved gift of forgiveness to the person. Commit to the forgiveness that you experience emotionally so that H, you hold on to that when you doubt. After people have worked through this method and achieved some level of emotional forgiveness, then we invite them to make a decision to forgive, which is down there at the bottom. That is the core. There's a lot more to that method than just the core, and I could go through that, but I'll show you some of the little exercises we do. So yeah, here's the full method for a group. We screen people because we don't want somebody who really needs a lot of individual help because they are really troubled, and and that a group is just not for them. They need individual counseling or therapy. So we screen out people who have a different type of need, and then we have people complete a self-assessment of a particular event that they want to work on, and then we ask them to tell in the group the hardest thing they ever successfully forgave. And they're willing to do that, and they will tell you these incredible, horrid things that happened to them that they have been able to forgive. And this creates in the group a real sense of, ability to share, because people are sharing these things that they feel victorious about. So this does not traumatize them in any way, because this is something they were successful at. In fact, what it does for them is to go, well, dang, I forgave that hard thing, and now I'm worried about getting, aggravated by a friend and I'm having trouble forgiving. Really, that puts it in perspective. Okay. We have them think about forgiveness in using a kind of a Lectio Divina type of exercise. We define emotional forgiveness and decisional forgiveness, go over the benefits. Remember, you're seeing the things that all of the different types do. We're doing these because we're one of those 14 types. And then work through the core, make a decision to forgive, and finally generalize through a 12-step program. And then take the same little assessments, which are very simple assessments and not used for research. They're just for the person's therapeutic use to show the person, yes, I have made a lot of progress going through this group. So here is a sample of exercises. This is just telling them that they choose an event to work with, and they fill out these simple self-assessments. In the group, we tell them to, a typical icebreaker in a group. What's your favorite dessert? Who are you? What's your favorite dessert? Oh, and by the way, what's the hardest thing you've ever forgiven in your life? they make a commitment to themselves, not to anybody else, to try to use the group to forgive. This is not a commitment to forgive. This is just to try to give a good old college try. We help them define the emotional and decisional forgiveness, which is not something people really would come up with on their own usually, by giving them a whole lot of choices of things that forgiveness might be confused with, and then we give them what on the back of the sheet of paper, what those things were. Two of them are, one's emotional forgiveness, one's decisional forgiveness. They talk about that in the group. Recall the hurt. We have them imagine that hurt and what was happening. We have them talk about what it was like to the person that they're next to. To empathize, we use an empty chair technique. I don't know if you all have seen this. Psychologists have used this for years and years, but you basically are having a conversation with somebody who's not there, and after you pour out your heart about why you know they hurt you and what it's meant in your life, you get in their chair and you respond back. This is like an operational definition of empathy. Sit in the other person's chair. And then they bounce back and forth, and we give them about 15 minutes to talk and have that conversation. Recall a time when you needed forgiving and somebody just hauled off and forgave you. What did you feel like? People will say, I felt free, I felt light, I felt like a weight was off my shoulders. They have the same kind of metaphors of freedom and lightness. And then we say, okay, now that you have experienced some empathy for the person who harmed you, and by the way, we're talking, 4 or 5 hours into the group here, so they didn't just read the last slide and move to this. It's a long time to think about it. Now that you've experienced some empathy for the person and you realize how good you felt when you were forgiven, would you like to forgive the person that you've been working to forgive? And internally they're going, nah, not really. And so we understand that people are like not willing to make just 100% commitment. And so we say, okay, well, look, you might not be willing to forgive wholly, but you came in with, let's say, this much unforgiveness toward that person. Up to this point, for 4.5 hours, how much unforgiveness do you have left? Did you reduce this by 80%, by 60%, by 50%? So we're just going to whip around the group and you tell me what percent of the unforgiveness you've gotten rid of in this group. And so then people name a number. Now what they're doing when they name a number, they're doing a couple of things. One of the things they're doing is they're committing to the forgiveness that they experience. That's, the C in the reach. But they are also shaping their internal experience. Does this make sense? Because once they say, well, I've forgiven 80%, they've created a kind of reality in their mind. I mean, who knows if we've really forgiven 80%? That's subjective. But once you put a number on it, that becomes their experience. So give that altruistic gift of forgiveness. So we have them fill out this kind of contract on a percent basis. How much have you forgiven? And fill out a certificate of emotional forgiveness. All of these things are commit to the forgiveness you've experienced so that H, you hold on to that when you doubt. Then we invite them to make a decision to treat that person differently, not to get revenge on the person, not to pay the person back, but to treat them as a valued and valuable person. And then finally, we just give them a writing exercise. It takes about 30 minutes to do, and it's a 12-step exercise, but it's not those 12 steps, okay? And it basically, they identify 10 wrongs that still have some lingering sense of unforgiveness, and then we just give them opportunities to think about those differently. One, to fill out a reach step on one of those, but also change your experience with the past. You can't change the past, but you can change the way that you're going to talk about it. So pick out one of the 10 events and write how you're going to speak differently about that. We just give them different ways of dealing with those events. This is what they have to do to generalize, to become a more forgiving person. And then finally, complete the assessments again. Well, I see I was going to go about an hour and 15 minutes. I've gone about an hour and 15 minutes, so I'm going to stop here, and I guess we're going to get a response, and then we'll have a time for Q&A that I guess both of us will be dealing with.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise with us. My name is Reverend Amanda Rigby. I am the Executive Director of the Well Mental and Spiritual Care, and we operate just up the road at Edenton Street United Methodist Church, where I also serve as a pastor. And I was so fascinated by the description of today's event, and having never heard of the academic or scientific study of forgiveness, I was really excited to get lessons from the expert, and so really, really grateful for this invitation. As I think about the work that I do, both in the practice that I help run, a practice of therapy, using evidence-based approaches, clinical approaches, as well as spiritual direction and life coaching, which is, we describe that as not clinical but relational work. I can see a lot of applications for this kind of work immediately, and especially contextually right now. So those of you who operate in church spaces also probably can appreciate the reality of the political turmoil that happens in our country, and that is happening, it feels like increasingly every day. There's more polarization between individuals and communities and whole groups of people, like you were talking about. There's whole groups of people that I, as an individual, need to work on forgiving, right? And I think that's true for a lot of people in the world right now. And one of the themes that we're seeing in our practice of mental and spiritual care is people coming for mental health care, people coming for spiritual guidance because they cannot forgive the people around them for the way that they voted, or the things that they're advocating for, or the way that they speak about other people. There is a sense of unforgiveness that people struggle with, and that unforgiveness then impacts their emotional, mental, and spiritual and physical health, right? And so I'm just thinking about how can we take research and science that proves the benefits of forgiveness, but also then apply them mentally and spiritually in communities, both on a one-on-one level, like we do in therapy and in spiritual direction and life coaching, but also on a communal level, as we think about the health of our communities and our own health as individuals. I'm also thinking about another population of people. So that's just general. I would say I'm just pulling this statistic. It's not very scientific, but I would say that in talking with our therapists and trained practitioners at our practice, we're a team of about 9 folks, and we see between 30 and 40 people every week. I would say 80% of the people that come to receive services at the Well wrestle with something like unforgiveness as a part of what they're going through. So it's increasingly common, and we're having conversations all the time in our practice about this reality that we're bumping into, which is that there's tension in communities around a lot of things, politics perhaps being the primary. So it's just a continual thread, and I think there's immense opportunity to apply the learnings of this field to just the reality of polarization that we face every day. And then the other group of people that we serve a whole lot that I think could really benefit from research like this, it's groups of people and individuals who have been hurt and left behind by the church. So we serve a lot of folks who maybe used to be church members or used to be Christian people who don't identify that way, who don't participate in church anymore because of the trauma, the wounds that they've received at the hands of church leaders and other church members in their community. And I think about the pain that those people bring into their sessions with a therapist, their sessions with a spiritual director or a life coach, and also how there's some spiritual wisdom that says that holding on to unforgiveness is like drinking poison and hoping that the other person will die. And I think we've seen that. We've seen that on the ground with real people who are struggling with this unforgiveness and woundedness, really. And I think for them, the injustice gap is huge, right? Like there's a lot of injustice that's been done to them, and probably the people that have wounded them, on the whole, have not repented, right? To use a Christian term, have not repented to help them find peace in the midst of great struggle and woundedness and trauma. And I think that forgiveness has a direct line also to healing. And I think regardless of whether, like you said, that happens in a secular space or in a religious space, the end goal is the same, and it's that healing and wholeness that is at the core of what we believe as Christians is salvation, right? Jesus came not to condemn the world, but to save the world, to offer healing to those who are wounded and sick. And so I'm just super grateful for this information. I took some pictures, definitely going to share the evidence-based models with our practitioners on the ground here in Raleigh. But yeah, I'm so grateful for the chance to have learned and thought this through with all of you. So I think now maybe there's Q&A. Okay, awesome.
Grab a microphone, and we're going to open it up to Q&A. But first, let's give Ev and Amanda a round of applause. So Amanda, I want to give you the first opportunity to offer a question, or Ev, if you want to respond to her response first, but why don't you have a little dialogue and you all start thinking of questions you have.
Well, I'm glad that you find some use in this.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
My life mission is to do all I can to promote forgiveness in every willing heart, home, and homeland. And that's kind of motivated me since the 1996, actually.
Yeah. Well, and I think the people that we work with, the people that come, are willing, which is great. They're already willing. They're there asking for support and for care because they know they need help. And so, yeah, we're lucky that the folks that come to us are ready to go. They're ready to do the hard work. There was a slide up there that said something like, these steps are external, but the hard work happens internally. And I think we really see that. I do have a question, if you don't mind. I would be curious to know how much you've engaged or applied your research in the conversation about politics in America, if at all. I don't know if you've had any overlap with what you've been working on and sort of this rising polarization that we see in society.
Yeah, so forgiveness is internal, but all this polarization and the conversations are external. So what we're dealing with right there is really not forgiveness so much, although forgiveness plays a part, but more reconciliation. So I wrote a book in 2006 that really laid out the stress and coping theory of forgiveness. And so Routledge asked me to revise that. But their criticism was that book in 2006 was like, forgiveness and reconciliation. And they wanted an equal voice. And so what I've been doing actually the last couple of years is really trying to develop a theory of reconciliation That's a stress and coping theory of reconciliation. And that is very directly involved, I've been blessed to get to deal with a lot of different cultures. 1996, I was actually over in South Africa as a visiting scholar for the South African government, and got an opportunity to not just to speak to 8 universities over there about forgiveness and reconciliation, but to meet with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I really have had a chance to do that a lot. And I came at forgiveness as a result of couple therapy. So we're talking reconciliation from the beginning. So I'm sorry to go on and on like this, but so the theory of reconciliation is really just kind of developing some principles about what to expect if you're trying to help people reconcile. And one of those is that you have to realize that every level is being dealt with. It's not just a person, but they're part of local groups that are supporting their view, and they're fussing with other local groups. And then there's the national scene, and they're seeing this in the news, every moment of every day, it seems like. So all of the levels are involved. So this is not going to be simple. This is going to be like complex, the theory of complexivity, where, and you all have seen this science of complexity, every time that there's a hurricane, you see 113 models, right? And you see how there is outer bounds, and you see the tracks that wind, and then you'll see this one model that takes off and says this is going to hit Bermuda, oh my gosh. And that's only one out of 100, because these models are very sensitive to the internal conditions. And for us, we don't know exactly how we're going to respond. And a lot of how we respond has to do with the 115 different variables that we are subjectively, trying to weigh. How do people look at me? What is my personality like? What's my, wife going to think about this? What about the people at church? How are they going to take this if I take this position? And, how is this going to fit in with national? This is not going to change, whether Homeland Security gets funded or not, So there's all these variables. So also with reconciliation, there's going to be waves that happened. And these waves, defeats come in waves. You've seen this. And, somebody does something unexpected and people respond to it in negative, and then the next thing happens and they retaliate, and then they retaliate. It happens in waves. But reconciliation also happens in waves. So if you can get some momentum and help people make some positive, steps forward in kind of dealing with this polarization, that tends to produce, some waves. Now, the next part of this is that there are things that happen now, and then there are reasons that have been in existence for who knows how long. And so there is a crisis du jour, right? So what people tend to do is they get swept up in the crisis du jour, and they forget about why is this happening, And yet what a couple therapist has to do is realize that the couple who's troubled is going to come into your office, and they're going to have a problem. Every week, it's a new problem. And the trick is don't get triggered by their problem and get swept up into we're just going to solve their problem. They have to use their problem as a window into understanding what happens underneath and a doorway into changing the underneath. So I do have to deal with their problem, but I also have to realize there are two levels. There's more to this theory of reconciliation, but I have had the privilege of dealing with it unsuccessfully a lot. And as a couple therapist, I wish that I could say I had 100% success rate. Nope. More like 60, 70%. Yeah.
Other questions? James.
Give us your best story that sticks out about what you've seen doing this for decades. Either a good one that sticks out or maybe a not so good one. Whatever that one that just came to mind is.
I'm going to repeat the question so our live stream can hear it. So the request was to tell us a story that kind of reflects this, the first story that comes to mind. Ev?
I don't know what it's going to reflect, but I do want to tell you about a guy that I met. So I guess this was back in back in the past sometime. I was invited to Los Angeles to be on the Lisa Gibbons show. I guess it's Lisa Gibbons, the Lisa show. And I was an expert, okay? So get this. So my job was to test two couples who had just gotten married and then to make an on-screen prediction about the future of their marriage. What do you think the validity of my, So I was the expert and I was having all the fun I could think of, but I met this guy who was a panelist, and his name was Chris Carrier. And Chris, as a 10-year-old boy, was abducted. And, he's got off from school. He's standing on the corner. This guy comes by in a pickup truck and says, "Oh, hey, your dad's giving a party for your best friend, and he sent me to pick you up and take you to the party." So Chris gets in the pickup truck. This is in Florida. And he is transported not to a party, but out in the swamp. And the guy gets him out of the pickup truck, and he has an ice pick, and he begins to stab Chris in the torso. And Chris said he was laying on his back going, "Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this?" And the guy got really remorseful and said, "I shouldn't be doing this. I'm sorry, I'll take you home." And he takes Chris outside this trailer, and when Chris steps up on the running board of the pickup truck, the guy puts a gun up against his head and shoots him through the head, and it comes out his eye and takes his eye with it. So Chris wakes up like 3 days later, and he's alive, and he heals up. Lost his vision, of course. But 20 years later, he's working, and he was a youth pastor at that point. 20 years later, a deputy comes by and says, "We've known who did this all along, but we never had any evidence. But this guy is on his deathbed, and he just confessed to this. Now, we're not going to prosecute him. He's going to die any day. But he does not deserve to go out of the world without being confronted." And so he takes Chris out to this guy, and Chris walks in and looks at the guy. And the guy's 20 years older than he was, but he recognizes him right away. It is the guy that that stabbed him and shot him. So he goes over to the guy, and the guy's name is David McAuliffe. He says, "So who is taking care of you? Because he looks terrible." And McAuliffe goes, "I'm taking care of myself." And Chris said, "Oh, yeah, well, if it's okay, I'll come and visit you, and I do forgive you for the things that you did." And so Chris was able to forgive this man, and not only to forgive him, but to be his primary caretaker for the last 2 weeks of David McAuliffe's life. To me, Chris is the poster child for, I mean, he's older now, but he's the poster child for forgiveness, and when I struggle to forgive somebody for something, for cutting me off in traffic, for flicking me off, if I'm riding my bike, I'm like, if Chris can forgive that, what is so hard for me to forgive this person for aggravating me on the road?
One thing that has helped me is I'm very strongly on one side of the political area, and I have some friends that are strongly on the other side. And I thought, how can I have a conversation with them? And the suggestion that I read on the internet was, what would Jesus do in that situation? Jesus was in a real battle with all these things going around. It was a hard thing for him to keep his cool sometime, you think. But what would he do? He would just love that person and not try to change their beliefs. Just be loving to them. And I have found that works.
So it's as much a comment as a question on polarization, on how to bridge that gap and trying to act like Jesus and love the other person. And that being a way to...
Tell them how you feel, where you stand, but then just love them, because you're not going to change them, but you can be a friend like Jesus always would.
The truck driver probably still thinks you're a jerk. So does the involvement of the offender figure at all into the process of forgiveness?
So the question is about the involvement of the offender in the process of forgiveness.
The offender, of course, has lots of options about how they're going to behave, and those will affect the injustice gap of the person who's trying to forgive. So yeah, the forgiver is, the offender is, a key player in changing the size of the injustice gap, whether increasing it by making it worse or decreasing it.
But my understanding from looking at your work too, because the forgiveness is internal, there can be no interaction with the person that wronged you and forgiveness can still happen. Is that correct?
Yeah, forgiveness is internal, and in principle, everything is forgivable. In practice, it looks like jumping over a 20-foot fence sometimes, and that's where changing the size of the injustice gap can work hand in hand with forgiveness. So remember, the injustice gap is something internal also. So if justice happens, we don't perceive justice the same way as Democrats and Republicans. So something happens and we go, that was a travesty of justice, or yeah, finally justice, you see. So what is going to affect my response is my perception of justice, my subjective injustice gap, not what really happens in society.
I happen to go to this church
So the question is about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, and particularly people that repeatedly are offenders, harm you. How do you navigate that?
So, yeah, forgiveness is really independent of reconciliation because we're talking about internal effects versus, behavioral effects. But they affect each other, to some degree. So forgiveness actually makes us yearn for reconciliation. So if we forgive somebody, even though they hurt us today and they're going to hurt us tomorrow, we would like to reconcile with them, but then our prefrontal cortex kicks in and we say, are you brain dead? Because they're just going to hurt you 20 times tomorrow. And so, my advice usually is you try to establish safety. This is what a therapist does, right? First, do no harm. First, create an atmosphere of safety. You don't have to reconcile, and so if that person is going to hurt you again and again, keep your distance as much as you can. We can't always. If that is the toxic boss, I've got to go to work tomorrow, and I've got to face that person, whoever it is. So as much as I can, I try not to be provocative and not to get up in their face and provoke more abuse, but just use discretion and try to keep a safe distance as much as I can. And it may come down to, I may have to change jobs because of that. So I want to find me a new job before I quit this one if I can.
One of the slides pointed out that there was a correlation between Christian forgiveness and decisional forgiveness that was more closely tied than emotional forgiveness and Christian forgiveness. And I was kind of thinking, we're living in a pluralistic world right now. Have there been studies about other enduring religious traditions in forgiveness? And bearing in mind many of the models you talked about are secular models, do we find faith traditions that are other than our own examining an issue of forgiveness and looking at modeling those as well?
So the question is about forgiveness in other religious traditions. Has it been tested? Are there models? What are we learning there?
Every one of the 5 major religions and many of the other religions have their own stance about what forgiveness is and what the conditions are. So in Judaism, forgiveness is not as big a deal, but teshuva, or what we call repentance, is the bigger deal. That is, their response is, don't put the burden on the forgiver, put the burden on the offender. And the offender has left the path of God. And to return, which is teshuva, to turn and return, then they need to do certain things. They need to apologize. They need to show regret. They need to, and remorse. They need to make amends to the extent that they can make amends. They need to illustrate that they will not do this again. And not just expediently so that they get your forgiveness, but rather they really have to prove to the community that they're not going to do this again. And then finally, they have to ask for forgiveness. So they to return, to repent, to teshuva, they need to illustrate all of those things. Now, the offender, the victim in Judaism doesn't have to forgive. But if they ask again, the the victim doesn't have to forgive. But if they ask a third time, then if they are refused to forgive at that point, they have left the path, and now they need to seek return. So now there are times when forgiveness is just given in Judaism, and by the way, that compilation of steps is Maimonides' approach to forgiveness. But you can see, if there is no victim, how can there be forgiveness? Because, if someone has been killed, has been murdered, then they can't show to them, that they won't do this again. They can't do all this stuff. That's why often Judaism will say no forgiveness for the Holocaust. The victims are dead and unable to forgive. I don't want to go on and on and on about this. But Islam, forgiveness is very important in Islam. And God, one of God's 99 names is a forgiving God. But in Islam, justice is something people are entitled to, and so, pursuing justice is like what you should be doing as a good Muslim. Forgiveness is ideal. It's wonderful. It is blessed by God. The person who forgives will receive all these blessings by God. But that's seen as more exceptional than it is in Christianity, where we are, enjoined to forgive all of us, as one of the two primary virtues of Christianity, love and forgiveness. So in Islam, have been a lot of studies on forgiveness in Muslims, and we've actually done several of those studies. We looked at Ramadan, and we looked at how they negotiate emotional forgiveness and decisional forgiveness over the course of Ramadan, and it turns out sometimes emotional forgiveness drives decisional, sometimes decisional drives emotional, and sometimes they seem to be on parallel tracks. So, and we've also used the reach forgiveness model with Muslims. We have the paper under review right now, and it was just as effective with Muslims in Indonesia as it was with the Christians in Indonesia. So we did a paper earlier pulling out the Christians, 200 Christians, and we had 400 Muslims. Same exact effectiveness. In Buddhism and Hinduism, they have their own stories. Buddhism doesn't really have forgiveness as a word that is used, but compassion is. And so you get the Dalai Lama writing a book with Desmond Tutu, and he's talking more about compassion. But again, replacing negative, unforgiving emotions with empathy, sympathy, compassion, and love. So compassion is always in there. In Hinduism, a lot, because it's a very diverse religion, a lot depends on which brand of Hinduism, but pretty much all of them do advocate forgiveness.
One last question.
I found the distinction between emotional and decisional forgiveness very interesting, and how they relate to flourishing. And I was surprised that it seems like decisional made more of an impact on flourishing, except in social situations. And is there like a reason
So the question is about the evidence that flourishing seems more connected to decisional forgiveness than emotional forgiveness, and why that might be the case.
I wish I had an answer for that one. You know, so we write this paper, and it's embarrassing when a scientist does this. When all of your hypotheses are, oh, emotional forgiveness is going to win the sweepstakes, and it turns out it loses the sweepstakes most of the time. We didn't have any definitive reason. Obviously, in science, you get these surprising findings, and hopefully you or somebody else then tries to figure out, why did this happen? And, you know, I don't know why it happens. You know, decisional forgiveness is not a cognitive, it's not a rational decision. It is cognitive, but it's cognitive only in the sense of Daniel Kahneman's view of cognition, which says that only maybe 5% of our cognition is directed to intentional rationality, and like 95% is pretty much intuitive, unconscious, you know, cognition. And so what that means is, you know, we hear decisional forgiveness, we think rationality, but it really is a pretty whole body concept, you know, in the reality of it. And so, you know, once you start thinking of what decisional forgiveness is, then it's not quite as puzzling, you know, it's not as starkly different as emotional forgiveness. You know, I do think that Christian forgiveness is decisional forgiveness, not emotional forgiveness. I think God, you know, basically requires of Christian to make a decision to treat the other person differently. And God desires that we have emotional forgiveness. But as Paul says, as much as it is up to you, live at peace with all people. And it isn't always up to us. You know, if the other person doesn't want to live at peace with us, our emotions are never going to go to zero. Our emotions are going to be riled all the time because they're throwing hate and hurt at us.
Amanda, do you have a final word for us as we move towards wrapping up? As you've listened to this conversation and reflect on your work at the Well?
I think the final word is just gratitude. Thank you. I feel like I've been given a gift that I will get to share, hopefully, with a lot of people. And I hope that you all feel the same, that this is, I think forgiveness can transform your life if you choose it. And so that's what I would hope for all of us here.
Ev, do you have a final word for us?
She said it all.
So I do encourage you, on the live stream link, we'll add this. Ev has a really rich website with all the workbooks, with all of his writing, maybe not all of his writings, but many of his writings. Lots of the guides work on self-forgiveness. I encourage you to look that up and consider it in whatever your context is. And I want to thank Amanda and the Well. I want to thank West Raleigh Presbyterian Church. I want to thank the North Carolina Council of Churches and those that are joining us remotely, and encourage you to check out Science for the Church as well. I hope you've gotten a taste of why we think it's important to bring science to the church. So thank you all, and go enjoy the beautiful weather here in North Carolina.